Hi there, this is John Kyo, and this is the third interview in the Future of Food series, where I interview 10 CEOs for 10 minutes to get their perspectives on the food industry and how their companies are supporting the efforts moving forward. And I'm delighted to have with me today Warwick Powell from Beefledger in Australia. Good evening, Warwick.
Hi, John. How are you?
Fantastic. I believe you're in Sydney?
I'm in Brisbane actually right now,
Oh, you're in Brisbane.
a little bit further north, and hopefully a little bit warmer than Sydney.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. I want to get an overview of basically who you are and the company pitch. Is that possible in 1 minute to give us the brief overview of you and the elevator pitch of Beefledger?
To be honest, John, I'm really hopeless at elevator pitches, but I'll give it a go. Beefledger is a company that aims to develop a general purpose blockchain technology enabled payments and provenance platform with a principal focus on the Australian beef export sector as its first use case. Myself personally, I had an early career in government post an aborted academic career. Marking exam papers at 3 a.m. didn't suit me very well, I discovered. And for the last 23, 24 years or so, I've been in private practice, largely, I guess, in what you would call investment banking. Put other ways, I guess, I've been involved in structured finance solutions, building new businesses, growing businesses, selling them, merging them, and those sorts of things.
Gotcha. And can you give me an idea of the research phase that you went through to identify the gap in the market and the opportunity that led to the formation of Beefledger?
Sure, absolutely. The exposure to the Australian beef industry came about 8 or 9 years ago, largely out of inquiries that were coming towards me from colleagues and friends and family in Hong Kong and mainland China. At that stage, and I'm thinking this would have been about 2012 or thereabouts, I was beginning to receive inquiries about Australian beef, and I began dabbling a little bit in some trading, where I was able to source beef and essentially move some paper and sell beef. The interest in Australian beef began to really pick up around 2013, and I was commissioned to undertake a due diligence and business case development process for a greenfield abattoir in Australia, principally to process cattle for the China market. That opened up a whole new world for me, John, in that it showed me that agribusiness was both vitally important to Australia, vitally important to people because it feeds people, and was actually far more interesting than many city folk could ever imagine. It was complicated. There were many moving parts. There were fantastic characters. There's climate. There are global markets intersecting with local markets. And I guess I saw an opportunity to get in the early days of Australian beef exports into China. As you dive into these industries, what we discovered was probably two things which ultimately led to Beefledger. One was that the payments processes in the beef supply chain were quite sticky. There was a lot of friction, and there remained, in the cross-border sense, all sorts of issues around certainty of payments and those sorts of things. The other issue, of course, was the emergence of extensive concerns in the China marketplace around food safety and food fraud. And my family members in China would caution me all the time about eating food locally in China. So much so that when we go back to China, John, my wife would insist that we send as much Australian product over before the kids go over, so that there was a good larder of food from Australia there for the kids. So I guess the experience of trading and transactioning in the beef space, together with very direct personal experience in the food safety arena, led me to think about how to tackle these problems. And coincidentally, we saw blockchain technologies as a pathway by which we can tackle both of these problems at the same time.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned blockchain, of course, food safety, food fraud, and you also mentioned payments, but I believe your solution is much broader than that. Can you talk about the other components that are key to the value proposition that you have?
Sure. Look, a lot of the blockchain and supply chain talk has been quite limited in their focus. There is a little bit of a view that because both of those words have the word chain in it, that somehow they're peas in a pod. The real world, as I think we're all aware, particularly if we've been in supply chains a lot in our lives, is far more complex than that. We have taken a view that blockchain technologies have a range of attributes that are incredibly useful and valuable in terms of being able to provide confidence in data states and their validity, the transparency of the rules by which data states are locked in, and those sorts of things. But we also seek to embed the digital aspects of data security with a very grounded sense of the physical dimensions of the product itself. So in terms of packaging, the security in the packaging, anti-counterfeiting, and those sorts of things are part and parcel of the layers that we approach this with. And we build into our ecosystem, if you will, a very strong sense of the role of economic drivers. And a lot of our research at the moment is focused around how we can deploy mechanism design and game theory ideas in the shaping of smart contracts. So we look at this issue of food safety, food fraud, authenticity, and payments really as a fabric of issues where if you tackle it with just one thread, that thread's always going to be weak. And we know that when threads are intertwined, they get stronger. And then eventually when you weave threads together, they become actually very, very strong. And we see blockchain technologies as one of those sets of threads.
Gotcha. Now, your focus is primarily on the Chinese market. Was that an easy choice or a difficult choice? And how were you approaching the Chinese market?
The choice was not a conscious choice, if you will, John. Initially, as I described earlier, it stemmed out of some personal experiences and some business opportunities initially. That said, the opportunity to do something in an industry that is growing rapidly, where the demand for Australian products, particularly in the beef space from the China marketplace, was growing exponentially, was something that was calling for people to take a fresh look at and to position, in the first instance, our industry in Australia in the best way possible to optimize the performance of the supply chain and to deliver and capture as much value as possible on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, there was and is a lot of family and friend connections in China that also calls to you to do something about making sure that as people get wealthier and seek and demand new foods and things, that they can be confident that what they're paying for is what they actually get. So in many ways, it wasn't a choice. It was a bit of a calling.
Gotcha, I understand. Now, you mentioned that in the Chinese market, of course, and we all know this, there are issues with transparency, with trust, consumer trust, especially. You have food fraud, food safety issues, and you just mentioned you put in several measures to link the physical or the logical blockchain level. Or the digital component of it with the physical assets through anti-counterfeit measures. But on top of that, how important do you see analytical science as a key component or critical component of delivering integrity into the supply chain?
I think all the elements of information that can provide a more comprehensive picture of what it is has an important role to play, including the analytical sciences. The challenge that I think the blockchain poses for us all in the way that we treat sources of knowledge, if you will, is how can we be confident in those sources of knowledge where we are increasingly operating in a world where perhaps there isn't so much distrust, but the prevalence of zero trust. And the role of institutions like analytical labs, for us, are very much embedded within their socioeconomic contexts, and the decentralized protocols involved in establishing a basis of common knowledge amongst a set of actors that have to work together, whether they like it or not, is a very powerful way of validating and credentialing a source of knowledge and information. So in a very general sense, John, the role of analytical labs and the sciences are, for us, what we would categorize as an authority-driven oracle. So the issues will be validating identities, protecting those identities in ways that ensure that they are not compromised in a digital sense, having a mechanism by which a collective of participants, namely those involved in an entire supply chain, all come to a common knowledge base that a particular source of knowledge is accepted as an agreed position to move forward on, and lock that into place. And in that way, I guess we are setting not a high bar, but creating an ecosystem where commerce can happen with a very low bar, where we are striving to build zero trust ecosystems where people can nonetheless conduct business as if there is trust.
Gotcha. Now, 10 minutes goes very fast and we're just over, but in 30 seconds or less, if you were in front of 30 startup food companies or 50 startup food companies, what guidance would you give them? They have products, they want to go to market. What would you tell them?
I think always put the consumer's interests first is what I would be saying to them. Understand what people both want and what they need. Listen to what the consumers and the buyers ultimately are looking for and be responsive to that. And ultimately, in the food space in particular, be very mindful that we're not just satiating a desire, we're also satisfying some of the fundamental ingredients of life, and therefore take an active, engaged and responsible attitude towards what you do and position yourself on the high ground.
Wonderful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. We have 10 minutes of wisdom from Warwick Powell from Beefledger. And Warwick, I'd like to thank you very much and wish you and the team at Beefledger continued success.
Thanks very much, John. And I know many of my friends and colleagues here look forward to these videos very much now, and we'd love to be able to share them around more and more.
Wonderful. We'll chat soon. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.